Welcome, friends, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Reccia Mandelcorn, and I'm the Manager of Community Collaboration at Aurora Public Library. Every year, APL suggests a book we think everyone should read and discuss as a community. This year's featured One Book, One Aurora selection is Scarborough by Catherine Hernandez. The novel follows the lives of three children who live in Toronto's low-income East End. Hernandez, herself a single mom who grew up in Scarborough, gives us a compassionate glimpse at the interplay of precarious housing, poverty, lack of educational supports, and the devastation this has on families. When I was planning events around One Book, One Aurora, I learned about the work that the Social Planning Council of York Region was doing on the right to housing, and through Yvonne Kelly, invited them to join our One Book, One Aurora community project. And here we are this evening with an amazing panel of community advocates and a Acela virtual space of concerned citizens. I'd like to welcome our panelists, Chris Ballard, CEO Passive House, former MPP, Ontario Ministry of Housing, Michael Braithwaite, Executive Director, Blue Door Shelters, Alyssa Brierly, Executive Director, Centre for Equality Rights in Housing, Clovis Grant, Executive Director, 360 Kids, Aleksandra Petrovic Graonic, Executive Director, Social Development Council, Waterloo. And our facilitator this evening is Yvonne Kelly. Yvonne Kelly is an anti-poverty and affordable housing advocate with more than 25 years of experience working in the fields of education and social service. She is co-chair of the Social Planning Network of York Region and is a founding member of the Affordable Housing Coalition of York Region. Please join us as Yvonne facilitates the Q&A session on the right to housing.
So I have questions for each of you individually, and I'll let you decide whether you want to take 1 to 2 minutes to answer them because we still have some other good ones to get to. Also, for those of you that are tuning in, please write your questions in the chat in the Q&A section so that once we get to that time, we will have a few questions there to start with. So these are individual questions that are really based on your expertise and experience that each of you come with. So Alex, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to give you choices here because you could speak about a lot of things. Alex and I are kind of colleagues because she's with Social Development Center Waterloo and we're with Social Planning Council York Region, and we've been so impressed with the work that they do, lifting the voices of people with lived experience, as she just spoke about, and people that are precariously housed. But Waterloo is also, this Social Development Center has also done an incredible amount of work around displacement. And maybe you could give us a definition of that, because I think a lot of these terms are very normalized or very well understood by people who talk about housing a lot of the time, but may not be as clear for those on the call. So if you could maybe speak to that, Alex.
Michael called it one of the taps that are pushing more people at the brink or into homelessness, and displacement remained invisible for all our municipal governments in the region, both cities and the region, because construction development was equal, economic development was equal prosperity, and light rail transit coming in was looked only through that lens of branding progress, whereas we never factored in what is being lost. The loss or displacement we're talking about today, thanks to collaboration with Professor Brian Doucette at University of Waterloo. He was the one who came and said, well, there is loss of units. There's no doubt about that. We see it every day and nobody is counting, but displacement is so much more. So physical and non-spatial displacement, which is lives, communities, activities, economic activity, culture, heritage, types of neighborhoods that are there, and none of that loss has been talked about. Data are not collected. They're even today difficult to come by. And through our work with precariously housed tenants in the region, we turned our focus to what is happening along the transit corridor there. There was no data, but life stories of people who have been moved outside of their communities and either lost their housing, being reno-evicted, and so forth. So in terms of what comes out of this whole process is turning attention of all municipalities in the region that it is real, it exists, it has many shapes and forms, it impacts even people who stay, right? And we are hearing, which is really important, from middle class neighborhood associations, folks who are noticing the changes and they're impacting them in many different ways and not all positive. So oral histories through data we collected in interviews is there because people who were displaced really needed to have that history kept so it's not forgotten. And a series of podcasts are available. We're collecting during the pandemic more that would also include questions around what the impact is during COVID, and actual tangible map that puts many locations. We are currently working with about 140 only in downtown Kitchener, looking what types of displacement, what are stories told around them, and making it tangible so we can mitigate what is actually happening and hopefully prevent further displacement as LRT continues in the region.
Thanks, Alex. I think that was a really good thumbnail summary of what that means. And now we're going to go to Clovis. So Clovis, can you talk a little bit about what you're hoping to achieve with the implementation of the Collective Impact Project to prevent youth homelessness? You spoke a little bit about it, but maybe you can give us just a little bit more insight.
Oh, absolutely. And I would summarize it in a few words. One, it's a mindset shift that we all need to have. Secondly, it's about collaboration. Thirdly, it's about prevention, and it's about young people. And so let me just go through each one at a time. First of all, mindset shift. Michael jumped on this early, and I just want to echo a lot of what he said. Really, we have to turn off the tap. For young people belong in homes with family, and however that's defined for them. And so why do we wait for young people to actually become homeless before we actually intervene? And so the project is about changing that mindset of waiting for youth to become homeless before we serve them. And so the second piece is we cannot do it alone. This is not the responsibility of simply agencies. And so the Collective Impact Project is funded by the United Way of Greater Toronto. And really, it's a 3-year project designed to bring the community, the York Region community together, all of us who work together to support young people. And it's not just the emergency housing programs. It's CAS, it's the police, it's EMS, it's addiction services, it's the mental health agencies, all of us, school board, it's all of us actually coming together to say, let's change the way that we are actually supporting young people. Let's not wait for them to become homeless. Let's think about what we can do on a prevention front to ensure that young people don't have to go through that crisis of homelessness, and let's intervene earlier. All the people that I'm talking to you about who are around the table, and we've got about 30 individuals and agencies around the table, we're all talking about how collectively we can work together to actually identify young people who are at risk earlier, work together, streamline our services so that we're not actually looking for new dollars necessarily, but what can we do with the existing resources that we have and actually working together to address this issue. So that's a collaboration piece. And the third piece about prevention, it's really thinking about preventing homelessness from happening in the first place by wrapping those services around young people. And the fourth piece of this is involving young people. Young people know, especially those who have been homeless, they know what those points of contact are. And we have not only a service providers around the table, but we also have a group of young people who have an equal stake in this collaborative effort. And they're giving us input feedback in terms of what we can do in developing this strategy to actually mitigate some of the issues that they saw when they were homeless, and giving us advice in terms of what we can do and how we can work together to address the issues of prevention. And so I would just conclude by saying it's a collaborative effort, and what I hope to achieve is not just a document that sits on a table to say, look at what we've done, look at what we've developed. But this is actually, first of all, coming up with that strategy, coming up with that plan, and beginning, and we're already doing that halfway through the project, actually coming up with tangible ways that we can actually embed this in our current system. And things like the York region using this project as a way to address some of the deliverables of the 10-year housing plan. That's embedded in the system. It's working with the school board to say, what can we do? How can we work with the different departments within the school board to say, how can we identify youth at risk in an earlier way? And this has been amazing to see the appetite for change, that mindset shift I'm talking about, that people want to do something, because the current way of just waiting for things to happen to that young person has to shift. And it's great to see so many different partners around the table in the New York region actually wanting to do something different.
Great, thanks, Clovis. We're going to go to Michael. So Michael, you've been doing this work for a long time. Do you want to say, are there any ways in which you do things differently now than you maybe did 5 to 10 years ago?
Yeah, I think things are always changing. I think for the longest time in York region, there was the thought that homelessness didn't exist, right? We're a very visual society, and if we don't see it, it must not be there, right? The average Canadian usually describes homelessness. I used to have a big beard, so they basically used to describe me as what they would see as homelessness. At least grade 8 students would be honest and say, it's a guy with old guy with a big beard on the street corner in Toronto, right? And we all know that homelessness looks like anyone in this panel or any other participants too, right? There is no look to it. It's a feeling of despair, loneliness, and frustration, right? So York Region was way behind. We didn't have a lot of shelter beds, and there was a need. On any given night, there's 1,500 people, right, that experience it. So I think when we first started, it was like, hey, how do we get more and more beds so we could get people off the streets? But what I've realized too is not only is that really, really expensive, it's not the right way forward, right? Housing is, and there was always this, 10 years ago, well, let's get them employed first. Let's make sure they're healthy. Let's do it, which are all good things before getting them housing. But what we've learned over time is, housing first. You get them into housing, they'll become healthier. They'll be better able to look after their health. They'll be able to look for a job because they have an address. And it really is that housing first with supports approach that I've learned. And really there's a million paths into homelessness and very few out, right? But listen, across Canada, what I know now is there's some people doing brilliant stuff. We don't have to come up with tonight or with this group, or we don't have to come up with all sorts of new original ideas. They are out there. We just have to listen, pay attention, and duplicate. When we talk about the right to housing, and make it into action, in Wales, they've done that one step further. The action is the duty to assist. You've got 2 weeks. And then if you don't do that, as Alyssa was talking about, there's, hey, 2 weeks you failed, and now there's repercussions for that, right? In Australia, to Clovis's point, there's, they're in schools preventing homelessness by they're identifying early in the Geelong project, people with challenges that might lead to dropout, which might lead to homelessness, wrapping supports around them, and they've seen their shelters empty out. It's affordable. It's the right thing to do. It's not really about spending money. It's about being smart where you invest that money to end homelessness and spreading it out to a variety of different things. And that's really what I've learned, is that it's way more than emergency housing that's going to end homelessness in Canada.
Thanks, Michael. That's a good trajectory to be on as opposed to the one we were on. Alyssa, I'm going to come to you now. So we've heard a lot about the right to housing and what a framework looks like. It can be a kind of an abstract concept, as we know. So can you speak a little bit to what that right to housing framework is and why in York Region that would help us to ensure that we're able to make progress on protecting, increasing affordable housing stock options, and so both protecting and increasing?
Absolutely. So there's a couple of elements of a right to housing or a rights-based approach to housing. There's sort of a substantive element to it, and there's a procedural element to it. And I'll just sort of speak to each of those at a high level. On the substantive element, there is an actual definition of the right to housing, and that comes to us through international law, and there's a few different elements to it. 7 different elements to it, and it includes security of tenure, so everybody having some level of security that legally protects them from forced eviction, harassment, other intimidation. Affordability is part of it. And so it's important that the financial cost of housing not be so high that it threatens the attainability of other important rights and needs that people have. Housing has to be habitable. It has to protect people from the cold, damp, heat, the elements, and other threats to health and well-being, sufficient space for living, etc. It also needs to be accessible to accommodate needs of disadvantaged groups, such as seniors, persons with disabilities, and it also needs to be in a location where folks have access to the services, schools, employment opportunities that they need. It needs to be culturally adequate. And it has to be close to services, facilities, and infrastructure. So that's the textbook definition of the right to housing. That's the substantive element to it. On the procedural side, there's a few additional important things here. So it requires rights-based decision making, which means that governments need to review the impact of any decisions that they make on the right to housing. And it also, as we've talked about earlier, makes human rights a primary consideration that takes precedence over other factors. It also includes coordinated governance and action within government, meaning, these circumstances that many of us who are familiar with, who have tried to make change happen through any level of government and faced with the circumstance of various silos, government departments operating in a very siloed way and not coordinating with one another. A rights-based approach would say that coordination is a really important part of this, and there needs to be a collaboration of action and resources across various departments. A rights-based approach to housing would also include setting goals, targets, and timelines for the reduction of elimination of homelessness, ensuring adequate housing for all residents over time, and that governments put in place specific policies and programs to meet those goals. It doesn't require solving these problems immediately, but it does require a plan to get there. A rights-based approach would also track outcomes using high-quality data that would be disaggregated by race, gender, age, income, and other variables, so that the impact of the policies and programs could be assessed vis-a-vis priority populations and equity-seeking groups. Policies and programs would also be implemented and monitored with the participation and leadership of diverse individuals and communities who are directly affected by inadequate housing and homelessness. And finally, as we've talked about before, there's also the important element of having independent mechanisms where individuals and communities could claim and enforce their right to housing. So the substantive elements of the right to housing, I think, provide some very helpful sort of framing to drive some of the outcomes that we're talking about here. The procedural elements speak to sort of how all of that happens. And I think, as we've talked about as well, there's sort of a third element of this that I think is really helpful when we think about what difference this could really make in York Region. And that's, again, the really important message that is sent when you acknowledge something as a human right. It means that it matters, and it matters more than almost anything else and any other competing interest. And, certainly I've seen very tangible ways in which a human rights lens shifts the nature of the conversation and helps to reprioritize that conversation, both at the level of the policy and at the level of individual projects. At the level of policy, a rights-based approach to decision-making, as I've mentioned, involves governments implementing protocols for staff and officials to review the impact of decisions on the right to housing, and a rights-based decision-making process would place human rights as a primary consideration that would take precedence over other elements in that decision-making process. At the level of individual projects, one of the best examples that I can think of is, when there's a project proposed, when there's an affordable housing project proposed, and governments often hold community meetings, and there's folks who show up with some version of, I don't want this development in my neighborhood. I don't want those people to live here. It's not, concerns about the character of the neighborhood and so on. If York Region recognizes housing as a human right and committed to implementing that, they would have an actual policy to point to that would allow them to say, I'm sorry, but your concern, the concerns you have about the character of your neighborhood are actually less important than someone's right to have a roof over their head. And that changes the channel on that conversation almost instantly. And, just sort of at a more esoteric level, governments have obligations for human rights, and they violate them at a very significant political cost. And so the political calculations involved in the conversation about housing can be influenced quite significantly by starting with the premise that housing is a human right and governments have obligations.
Thank you, Alyssa. So we're now going to go to Chris. And Chris, we wanted to hear from you as a former provincial minister of housing. Could you speak to some of the opportunities that maybe you saw to advance the work when you were in that role, or that you would choose to focus on now if you still had that portfolio?
If only I knew then what I now know, or know now, as the old saying goes. I would certainly be much louder and much more vocal, especially around the area of basic income, and pushing municipalities to utilize the tools they already had. So maybe, I like what Alyssa's saying, that you need to give municipal politicians an easier out, because right now there is an awful lot of pressure, and I come from being a municipal councillor as well. There's an awful lot of pressure to not allow densification, to not allow secondary suites, to not allow laneway buildings, simply when a few people who are active come and yell at you. You're terrified of that because you may not be elected next time. But if you had an easier way or something you could point to that said, oh, geez, sorry, got to do it, because if we don't, we'll be in big trouble. That may make things a bit easier. I wish if I was doing things again, I would be a little more vocal for even more money than the hundreds of millions of dollars we managed to pull out of the Treasury for social housing upgrades. I would continue to push the federal government hard on the National Housing Strategy, version 3 we need, that continues to fund social housing to a level that we require. But, at the end of the day, there's so much that needs to be done. One wonders where you begin. And I guess you begin by returning to some of the basics, and that's about educating people about the true cost of homelessness. What is it costing them as a taxpayer for the whole system, for not only emergency housing, but for social justice, for healthcare, We don't do a good job of educating people about that and really seeking them to buy in. They're all for it until there's an affordable housing project going in at the end of their street. You know, we see this time and again, but we need to really, we really need to take a step back, I think, and work with the public and really bring them on board. We need to give, you know, municipal governments have so many planning tools at their disposal right now. They don't need more regulation necessarily from the provincial government in order to act. They already have the Places to Grow Act, which talks about densification along major transit corridors. They already have legislation ordering them to implement secondary suites. But they get around that one by also implementing parking bylaws so that unless you're providing 2.2 car spots for every secondary suite, and oh, by the way, you can't expand the size of the driveway on your nice bungalow, until they are willing to stand up and say, we need to do this. You know, the funny story is 30 years ago, I wrote a letter to the local newspaper. There was debate going on about secondary suites and even the building of apartment buildings in my town of Aurora. And I innocently wrote to the newspaper and said, I thought it was a good idea. This was maybe 25 years ago. Thought this was a good idea. And I was lambasted by all sorts of people in the playground as I went to pick my kids up who were just in kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2. Who said, you know, we don't want those sorts of people. We only want people who can buy a house in our community. We don't really want renters and, you know, so, you know, be quiet, which I wasn't. But, you know, the council of the day really didn't do much. So we fast forward 20 years and now I'm minister. And I have a number of people coming to me to say, my kids can't even find a place to buy in Aurora. My kids can't find a place to rent in Aurora. They're having to move, you know, hundreds of kilometers away. Well, a number of those people were the very same people who told me to shut up and not press for affordable housing and changes to zoning within our community. So, but it's too late. We've lost so many opportunities. But I'll go back to my opening statements. You know, we need politicians who understand, and we really need to make sure that, I guess, it's the demonetization of the value of houses. I'm not going to stand up and say to an 80-year-old that I want to see their house sell for half of what it's worth. I'm not going to be the one to say that. What I want to be able to say to them when they're younger, when they were 40 or 30 and looking to get into housing, that, you know, if they lived in an apartment, it doesn't matter. They'll be taken care of because houses are not going to go up by as much as they have. That's where we need to look at. We need all sorts of tools that maybe have nothing to do directly with housing. So improved pensions, basic income for folks, even abilities to, I mean, there's no investment vehicles for people who are employed right now to make enough money to retire on. So the only thing they've got really is their house or their condominium. It's completely out of whack. And the last thing, I guess, and I'll stop here because I'm bouncing all over the place. I really wish 10 years ago I knew a lot more about a modern monetary theory. I only really started to learn about it when I joined the Treasury Board with Ontario. And, you know, the argument I had continuously ever since I entered provincial government is that balancing the provincial books is not the same as balancing your company's books or balancing your household books. It's got, the two are as completely opposite as day and night. And the sooner politicians understand that, because my own colleagues didn't understand modern monetary theory or in essence, how you finance government, they didn't understand it. Because they didn't understand that some of the greatest pushback to spending came from within our caucus, who thought that you balance the province's books the same way you balance your own checkbook at home. So we have a lot of work to do at that really high level, but it all begins with, I think, you know, continuing to push citizens with a variety of reasons for why they need to support affordable housing in their communities. Least among it, perhaps their children could be living in Aurora close to them if they had a back my call 25 years ago.
Very true. So we are looking at 8:03, and we have lots of great questions coming into the Q&A. So I'm going to have to collapse a couple of our last questions, and we'll hold everybody to a minute on this final question. So we haven't really had a chance to talk much about the financialization of housing, what that means. So in our final question, where I'm asking each of you to make a statement, what would you say to our regional leaders and mayors today about their role in meeting the challenges of providing housing for all residents? We've seen across the globe now that it's really mayors of large cities that are taking up the gauntlet on this and putting in regulations around that do rein in speculation and commodification of housing, whether it's Airbnbs, vacant units, that kind of thing. So if anybody wants to incorporate something about that in their final statement, that'd be welcomed, because we aren't going to get to really delve into that too deeply. But yeah, I'm just going to go to Alex to start. And what would you say would be your message or final statement, Alex, to the decision makers in our region about what direction to go?
Final statement. So early in the evening. It is a big topic to start at municipal or regional level. And I think through the process of affordable housing development, particularly with the city of Kitchener, that succeeded in having all municipal partners involved one way or the other. It is to support thinking where they do have a greater role in terms of ensuring land and supporting acquisition of existing stock that can get us faster to achieve long-term, affordable, outside of the speculative market, construction, creation of housing, and of course, working with a range of mostly nonprofit developers that do include all other aspects of life besides just having a roof over the head in their approaches, more so than still believing that for-profit developers and large players in that arena would be providing for human rights before profit. So that's my
Great.
word.
Great final statement. Thanks, Clovis. And I will hold you guys to a minute this time because we want to get on to the questions. So Clovis.
Okay, a few quick things. One, I think mandating, I love some of what Chris was talking about, that no way out. I mean, when you're building, mandating that a certain number of units have to be affordable housing. I think that can help us get through this. Exploring different types of housing. Gone are the days where people need 3,000 square feet. Let's look at different models of housing, and I know that there are models of shared housing. So let's think about how we can actually utilize stock. Some of the things that we've been looking at is how we use existing stock and through partnerships, whether it be, in our case, we worked with TRCA, we worked with MICA, we're doing some work with Metrolinx. Like there are different people who own houses, and houses sit vacant for long periods of time. Let's look at ways that we can actually utilize the existing stock and use that for housing.
Hey, just under a minute. Good for you. Michael.
We just have to push our municipal leaders really to put policies in place that don't allow buildings to stay vacant. And we've seen that, and you saw that somewhat in the film too, when people did that, what a change that is, and not to profit with empty. And we're not talking about one or two homes. We're talking about massive neighborhoods that they're taking on. I mean, you see it in Toronto a little bit with John Tory. He's putting his provincial and federal counterparts on notice and pushing them, saying we need more money. This is a crisis. We need to, and I won't say who. I talked with a municipal mayor a couple of years back about a vacant home, and he said, many people have asked me about that home, and I said, yeah, and yet you've done nothing. It still says vacant because it was an election issue, right? He wasn't going to get voted out of office because of homelessness and housing. Let's make that, let's change that. It's up to us to push that on people, right? Moving forward.
Brilliant. You guys are good at this timing thing when I remind you. Chris.
I will try for the record here. What would I tell my municipal politician representatives? I would simply say, if you want your community to be a sustainable community, that is a place where that people want to live and work in today and in the future, you need to ensure the development of affordable housing takes center stage. Use the tools already at your disposal and just get it done. I mean, municipal politicians and their staff know what to do. They have a plethora of tools given them by the province to get it done, whether it be private or private-public partnerships. They know what they can do to get it done. They just have to stand up and get it done.
Thanks, Chris. A challenge from someone who did that role for a number of years. And Alyssa, bring it home for us.
I want to go back to sort of the first part of your question around financialization, because I think it is one of the most concerning developments when it comes to housing. And I think it has to be a major focus of all levels of government. There's a number of different ways that financialization manifests, but for folks who would have joined for the film Push, you would have seen what I think is probably the most pernicious of those, which is where large, often multinational corporations develop a business practice of purchasing older buildings that some people might describe as run down or undervalued, renovating that building, kicking out all the current tenants and bringing in new tenants that pay much more for their units. There's companies who have done this all over the world, displacing thousands of some of the most vulnerable people, and they're doing it in our communities. And their actual business model is based on displacing people. And that is despicable. And it is not acceptable. And governments need to do something about it. And there's all sorts of policy interventions that are possible, but I think at a really high level, there's financial incentives. So those are the carrots. And then there is the regulations which serve as the sticks. And I think there's a little bit of both that can be applied to this circumstance. Vacancy decontrol and policies that allow sort of rent to increase out of control and away from what people can pay as soon as units are vacant provide huge opportunities and incentives for this kind of behavior. And those types of loopholes can be closed, and they probably should be closed. And also incentives to increase the stock of affordable rental housing would help remove some of the distortions in the market. And then certainly on the regulatory side, there's limitations that can be placed on what purchasers of rental housing can do with that housing. And this is, I think, where there's a big opportunity for municipal governments to play a role through things like zoning regulations. So I think there's lots of opportunity. I think it comes down to political will and really understanding the depth of this problem and how very significantly it's impacting our housing market.
Thanks, Alyssa. And I think we really do need to have almost a separate conversation just about that, because it is so complex, but it is, like you said, pernicious, and it's driving, if there was an underbelly to all of this that's really creating this crisis, that's it. And a lot of the other things that we focus on are small potatoes compared to that one. So we need to really get ahead. Somehow I muted myself.
Yeah.
We have over 25 questions, so we're going to try and get to as many as we can. So if people can stay with us, this is going to be like one of those rush to the buzzer ones. So if you really want this question, unmute yourself and just go for it. First question. The current provincial government is relying on the market to solve the housing crisis, but developers continue to build large luxury homes in York Region. What policy changes would you each like to see at the provincial and municipal level to provide housing for all? Not everyone's going to be able to answer this, but if you really want to, I want at least two of you to give some suggestions to that one. Chris.
I put my hand up.
You had your hand on the buzzer.
I had my hand on the buzzer. It's simply about densification, especially along transit corridors. We have to get back to the philosophies, in the places to grow legislation that don't allow 4,500 square foot mansions to be built within so many meters of transit corridors. That's how you pay for transit corridors, by having people live there so they will use it. Government knows how to do it. It just needs to do it. And the private sector needs to understand that there's also good money to be made in building, you know, to high density, and not the 4,500 square foot mansions.
Excellent. Does anyone else want to speak to that one? Or we'll go to a next question. Okay. Oh, Alyssa, go.
Yeah, just really briefly. I mean, I don't know. I don't know that we need any sort of complex policy here. Governments approve what gets built, and so governments that are committed to building affordable housing will approve developments that provide affordable housing, and governments that are not interested in that will continue to allow the kind of developments that we continue to see. So I think it's a question of political will. I mean, certainly a policy commitment for things, for affordable housing, and committing to, you know, inclusionary zoning policies, for example, which I think sort of touches on what Chris was talking about. Certainly help and spread this sort of responsibility for creating affordable housing among all developers, not just those who specifically set out to create an affordable housing development. But I actually think it's more of a question of political will than sort of a policy mechanism that we need here.
Thanks, Alyssa. I'm just going through the questions because we have some people who've written some really amazing questions couched within, which is almost the length of a thesis. So there's a question here. Are people aware that zoning has changed, that homeowners can build a garden suite or a basement apartment in Ontario? All homeowners can make a difference providing low-cost rental. Who wants to speak to that? Because there is some caveats to that.
Can I go first again, please? Well, you know, one of the things that we took across the province was the secondary suite. Yes, every municipality is to have legislation permitting secondary suites. But what most municipalities have done is they have put parking bylaws in place that make it impossible for you to build a legal conforming secondary suite. Until municipalities take that back off the table and allow, you know, one parking spot, or heaven forbid, no parking spots for their secondary suites, not many of them are going to be built. So again, you know, there is regulation, but it's very difficult. In terms of laneway suites, fantastic idea. As with all construction, we hear from developers how lengthy and expensive the process is to get all the permits and the time. If we were to fast track these type of developments at a municipality, if a developer walked in and said, I want to build an affordable building, or I've got a laneway or a secondary suite, we don't have to give them tax credits. We don't have to give them money. We simply have to expedite the approvals process, because for a developer, time is money. I've heard that time and again from developers who've said, you know, keep your grant, just would you get my permits approved so I can get on with building this thing? You know, every day that I'm not building, I have to pay more interest to the bank. So there's a lot of things that we can do, or governments can do, that doesn't have to cost anybody anything.
Does anyone else want to add to that one?
I would just to briefly add that bylaw change with the City of Kitchener is pretty in line what would be a good direction. As Chris described, there is no requirements for parking of a sort. And we are hearing that there is more asks for permits to create secondary suites. On the other hand, talking to a number of lived experience groups, particularly concerned with accessibility, and also hearing from some of the potential new landlords, we would need better information. What are the option supports through the process for creation of more suites, and how to support them as future landlords, considering again accessibility, respect of human rights. We know that enforcement is almost inexistent for tenants particularly, which small landlords do not like to hear. They feel the brunt on the other side. But there would be a lot of important community conversations, neighborhood conversations to happen, and have more support for people who are getting into that space.
Thanks,
Yvonne,
Alex.
if I could just
Yes,
add one last thing
for
very
sure.
quickly. I mean, just on top of what Chris is talking about, get out of their way, offer some financial incentives as well on top of not putting barriers in the way. I know in Lanark County, they took some of the Reaching Home money and they said if you build a secondary suite, you can apply for interest-free loans, that type of thing to get the process moving, and that was effective.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Michael. So here's a question that kind of goes to the financialization piece that Alyssa was talking about that really was the focus of PUSH 2 weeks ago. So this question looks at PUSH identified financial organizations that create investments where existing properties are bought, condo towers are built but remain unoccupied because they are simply a financial tool. It seems as long as cities receive the taxes, they turn a blind eye to this, and this type of development removes available land and homes for ordinary people. Why is the government not being shamed into simply banning deliberate empty properties? These properties price availability out of the realm of most people, and they contribute nothing to the city. This is actually an unsustainable development. And I would just add to that that I know from talking with people in the York Region Police that they're not exactly thrilled with having to protect some of these empty properties, which costs taxpayers money as well. So when they get calls because vandalism and from neighborhoods, people in the neighborhood when there's empty properties sitting there. So it's all those other costs that people don't think about. Anyway, who would like to take that?
I can jump in. So I completely agree with the comments. I think in terms of why there isn't a lot of action happening on this front, I think frankly, a lot of people don't understand that this is going on and appreciate the scope of the issue. I live in downtown Toronto, and there are buildings down here where, you know, upwards of 50% of the units are being sold as secondary suites for folks who may never rent them out, or who, you know, up until very recently may have counted on Airbnb, for example, as the main way that they were going to occupy those suites. And all of that affordable housing stock, or what could have been rental housing stock, was taken off of the market. And I think there are some policy interventions that you can see governments taking to address the empty homes issue and the very obvious speculation that's going on. And one of them is by regulating the way in which people can use Airbnb in the city of Toronto. The way in which that is meant to happen here is that folks can rent out on Airbnb a secondary bedroom in their currently in the home that they are occupying. But if it is a self-contained unit, that is not something that, according to the City of Toronto bylaws, can be rented out through short-term rental. So that's sort of one way that this is being addressed. Another way, of course, is the empty homes taxes that are being applied in a number of jurisdictions. And I think certainly the data in Vancouver and France as well would suggest that they are quite successful in bringing units back online.
Anyone else?
And I would echo that, and I had alluded to the different opportunities for partnership. If these houses are remaining vacant, let there be some incentives for them to actually lease them, even for short-term periods, to not-for-profit providers who can actually use them for housing. And I think different tools like that will actually help drive the prices down, because if the more people generate revenue from these units, the higher the prices are, and it becomes a very unsustainable model. So we need to find a way to keep the prices down, but at the same time look at ways that we can actually utilize the stock that is available.
Thanks, Clovis. We're going to go to a national housing strategy question. So is the national housing strategy anticipating the numbers of aging Canadians, including the growing numbers of working poor, many of whom are women, who will reach retirement age and not have sufficient pensions to secure or maintain housing? Is affordable home ownership going to be integrated into this plan? Mortgages and taxes used to cost less than rent. That's a mic drop. Mortgages and taxes used to cost less than rent. So who wants to take that one on? Or just offer a comment. We can't solve all these things. We don't know necessarily, like maybe we don't know the answer to that, but it's certainly something to give some thought to.
We have recently have more conversations or renewed conversations also about home share, right? There are a couple of instances where that program started intergenerationally and then in smaller scope was for particular demographics. We are currently having some interest of our municipal governments in Waterloo region to explore it, and it will be part connected to the affordable housing strategy development as well. So sharing homes, right? There is, with the aging population as well, more space that's being liberated that can be used.
Thanks, Alex. And I don't know the answer, obviously, but is there anything in the National Housing Strategy that talks about the growing need, so of affordable ownership? Does anybody know the answer to that? Okay, something we can do some research on. So we're keeping all these questions, and hopefully we can get back to people with the answers, even if we can't provide them tonight. So I'm going down the list here. Some really good questions. It's hard to choose. Okay, so here is a question. How do you compel ministries such as finance in Ontario to recognize the incremental costs of doing nothing or keeping the status quo because of the costs of doing something as a line item in things like estimates? So finance in Ontario. That might be a Chris Ballard question. Not to put any pressure on you, but.
Well, the simple answer is that if the Premier wants to make it so, the Premier makes it so. The unfortunate part would be the next Premier could back out on that and it would disappear. But it's, you know, what's the accounting terminology? Is it true cost accounting or something like that, where we get a good understanding of what the cost is to do something and what the cost is to not do it? They don't. Just to expand on that point a bit, what we also need is just not having that reported out in estimates. It's very difficult for most people to understand, even journalists, to figure out where to find that. And having sat on the estimates committee, even my eyes glaze over when I think back to those days. But every single ministry, as Alyssa was talking about in terms of rights, we'd started down the path of every single ministry having to report on and internally understand how they touched on poverty reduction, what the costs were, what the cost savings were. Every single ministry, we were putting them through the meat grinder, as they called it, and looking at all of their policies and procedures to see how that affected poverty reduction. We need to do the same with finance, and we need to do the same with housing and poverty reduction, of which, you know, housing is affordable housing, social housing is key. So if the Premier wants it, the Premier gets it. It's that simple.
Yvonne, I would also just add is we can't sit back and expect, I mean, the politicians have a responsibility, but it's our responsibility to bring them feasible solutions too, right? So, you know, for Clovis and I and others who go in, it doesn't matter who's in government, it is our mandate to go and work with them and try and show them solutions. The current government in Ontario right now, you know, it's about fiscal responsibility. So if you could show them that in providing housing, they're actually saving lives and saving money, sometimes that goes a long way. You got to continue to push that economic model. The other piece too is to use what we commonly get things through is by using the term pilot. When you use the term pilot or demonstration project, it's a little bit of BS, but it really takes the risk off that if it fails, it was only a pilot, but if it succeeds, then we could build on it too, right? So there's ways around it, but you actually, we have to bring them more solutions and evidence-based solutions from around the world. Like I said before, there is enough evidence and stuff around the world of great things happening around ending homelessness, great home ownership models, affordable housing. We don't have to reinvent it. We just have to duplicate it, rip it off, bring it to Canada, and push it forward. Do a pilot.
And thank you for that,
Yeah.
Mike. And one thing I think important to note is I think moving away from the siloed approach with each ministry. I think that's where what Chris was saying, looking at poverty reduction across the table. And when you keep doing things in silos, you don't actually see the impact. And so if we can start looking more interministerially across the table to see, for instance, with young people, that they hit the education sector, they hit the justice sector, they hit the children's sector, they hit mental health. You can't just operate in individual ministry silos. You have to look across the table and do more of that kind of work as well.
Some great solutions. And I think, it's interesting because every government comes with different approaches. To your point, Chris, this government has really pushed for municipalities to legislate second suites and garden suites or auxiliary suites, whatever those are called. And we see a lot of municipalities dragging their heels on that. So it's a complicated discussion because everyone says, well, that level needs to do this and we need to do this. But if everyone could just agree, we'll do what's within our ability. So you can't blame the province right now that there's not legislation or real promotion of municipalities accepting this legislation. But then there's other things that municipalities want to do that the province won't allow. So we really need to see less kind of pushing the blame over and finding the ways in which every level can do what they need to do. I've got a couple of questions here. I'm just going to combine them because they're about land. And so to your point of we need to bring them ideas, Michael, lots of people are bringing ideas. So we have a couple of people who are not-for-profit sector developers who have money, who are ready to go, who want to find land that is more affordable or maybe lease that land so that they can take advantage of CMHC funding and do building. And they're getting all kinds of pushback from municipalities right across the GTA to be able to get in and start doing that. So what do we say to those folks? So, we've said, take the initiative, bring the ideas. Anybody that's willing to start a not-for-profit and start to build housing, you got to give them a lot of credit because it's a lifetime of work, but they're still getting pushback. They're still not kind of having anybody roll out the red carpet. So what do we say to those folks?
Here's a suggestion to those folks too, is that I think in the panel's talked about it tonight, we're stronger together, right? And I'll give you, for instance, right now, Blue Door has a property, and could we do more? We have this little house on this big property. Could we do more with it? Yes. Do I know anything about development or building? No, I don't. But there's partners that do, that can push that agenda, that know that work, that know the players, that know people in government, and that partner's Habitat. And that talks about, we just spoke about some home ownership, some rental, full market, some affordable, deeply affordable rental. So you work with partners to do that. So my suggestion would be reach out to different partners. Don't do it alone. People who that's their skill set versus your skill set. Everyone brings a little bit to the table. You are stronger together. You're going to get it done faster.
Okay, here's a comment I just want to share with you because I think this is a comment on how great the panel is. Markham is having a housing summit on November 18th. I would suggest that this panel get an invitation to attend, maybe present. So we can also work on that. Let's go through and see what else we have. Okay, so another question, and we didn't get a chance to really talk about this in the first hour, but obviously it's come up a few times around COVID and what the new challenges are for folks who either face maybe eviction now and that as we're heading second wave. So that kind of relates to Bill 184, but also just people who are feeling very unsafe as homeless people to live in shelters. And so we're seeing an increasing number of encampments right across Canada. Can someone speak to what that situation begs of our municipal and regional leaders in terms of, this is the last place really people want to be, is without a home, especially during a pandemic. So how do we apply a right to housing framework and a human rights approach to making sure that they are as safe and as taken care of as possible? So anyone can speak to that. I think it's
I'll speak.
Clovis and then Alyssa. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, I mean, we saw this. I mean, our population is young people, and we certainly saw that for those who were not housed, in terms of how do we ensure that during a pandemic that those needs are met, and coming up with different solutions, whether it be transitional facilities. We've accessed hotel spaces. We've looked at ways that we can change some of our spaces to accommodate more single occupancy. So there are different things that with some of the additional COVID-related funding that was able to make happen. And so it's, I think number one is making sure that those individuals who are who don't normally come into shelters, we think about them and find ways to make sure that we make it accessible. As one young person said to me, it was really, really difficult to just do something as simple as taking a shower. And that should not be. And so it's just making sure that they're top of mind for us.
Thanks, Clovis. Alyssa?
I think that this is, I think it's a great question. And I think, encampment sites have increased significantly across the country at a very alarming rate since March of 2020 when COVID hit. And it's not as though there were no encampments before COVID was around, but I think what happened is exactly sort of what you described, Yvonne, and what was in the question, that people were encampment residents who had perhaps previously been at a shelter, or who may have contemplated being in a shelter, were taking, like the rest of us were, taking public health advice about how to keep themselves safe, and did an assessment of some of them sort of congregate settings where there's lots of folks in an enclosed space, and made the calculation that they were safer outside than they were in some of those places. And I mean, that says a lot, and there's sort of a lot to talk about just in that statement alone. I think just sort of a few things to highlight. I think you're absolutely right, Yvonne. Nobody aspires to sleep in a tent in a park in Canada. Like nobody wants that. People do that because it is their least worst option. And so we have to do better, because that is, in my estimation, and I think for many folks, the worst violation, the worst violation of the right to housing is homelessness and people sleeping outside. And it is absolutely unacceptable. And that is where governments, not only have a moral and ethical obligation to do, to work with all deliberate speed to address that, but they actually have a legal obligation too. And that is where international law is very clear. That is a very clear violation of the right to housing at international law. And what governments need to do is to work rapidly to find safe and adequate indoor space for those individuals. Governments have been opening up spaces in places like hotels, and in some cities have acquired entire buildings, and that is great. And that needs to continue to happen, because there are still many people who are outside and who don't necessarily feel safe in some of the shelter settings. But but absolutely, this is to me the most fundamental violation of the right to housing, and it requires it requires a lot more, I think, attention and movement than it has had.
Thanks, Alyssa. And I guess the second part to that question, and I want to go to Alex. She's got her finger up. If you want to speak to that, but also, so what rights do people have? I mean, because I think when they're not in a home and they're actually living in the public space, it feels like they actually then not just lose the ability to be safe, but they also become criminalized and become treated as such. And so what kind of rights do we have what kind of rights and what kind of ways can we protect and make them safe, even if that is their choice and because they don't have the other options? Alex.
Well, that became focal point for community movements and initiatives during pandemic when our community cities shut down. And there was no access, unfortunately, there's still no access to basics, washrooms, hand washing, access to drinking water. And what we have been hearing from community members who became a lifeline, an extension of formal and shelter and outreach services for those greatest violations. They are the ones who provide either food or drinking water. Now it is getting cold. They are absolutely opening up broadly conversations to decriminalize poverty, homelessness. To great extent, if we look who are the people who do not fit within the systems as they are today, again, disproportionately Indigenous population and people with disabilities. So it's a very difficult conversation. We have from University of Toronto, right, University of Guelph, there's an initiative that maps Canada-wide neo-vagrancy laws, tradition 700 years old, that exist in all our communities, from loitering to obstruction of passage to sheltering in a public space or a park. Basically, they have nowhere to be. And sometimes the encampments are longer in public spaces. Sometimes we have seen extraordinary collaboration across the board, from private to community, where a Better Tent City has been set up, not at the core of the city, in an industrial zone, and municipality agreed to change or suspend the zoning bylaw for that to exist. And then regional government had to look at, can we have a landlord, right, willing landlord accepted at this location to be able to get some shelter allowance for the people. And so people organize, people survive, they're extremely resilient. There are reasons why they are, very good reasons, of course, why they're not in the system as it is. It will take some trust for them to acknowledge and accept dorm style shelters, where for the first time they will have a key. That's amazing, right? To have some autonomy within the space that's available, and there is more spaces coming through collaboration across the region. So it is possible, and as much as municipal governments want to have the conversation mostly within a space of the only solution is permanent housing, the community across socioeconomic stripes is saying, yes, what about today? And porta potties, we want to see hand washing stations, we want to see more public locations open and accessible. It's a dialogue. It's a broad community movement that we're seeing. So what attracted me as well to the panel is, how do we work as a community? Well, really recognizing the whole continuum, and everybody has a voice. And most of all, people who live in the encampments, for the reasons they don't have to justify why. To have supports, to have basic needs met, the only, as one of them said, the only box they have to tick is to be human. So I think that's a perfect sentence from one of our associates.
Yes, that's profound and so true, and it needs to be recognized more. We're gonna take a couple more questions. I really appreciate you guys hang in as long as you have. This person is asking, how do you claim a right to housing? Who is responsible for ensuring that right? And I think this is critical context. So governments will contest that right, and those affected have no means financially or in terms of sometimes the knowledge or wherewithal to really push that issue. They lack the space, the resources, and the tools to claim their rights. So I think that's a really key question.
I can jump in here. And I mean, I could talk for hours about some of this. So I'll try to keep this brief. I think maybe I'll start with a final comment and then work my way sort of upwards in what I see in the Q&A here. So you're right. I think, Gail, you're right that governments have contested that right historically. And there have been a number of attempts by activists and lawyers and affected individuals to claim through the courts a right to housing, most recently through a constitutional challenge that my organization was involved with long before I got there, called Tanu Jaja, that spanned the years between 2008 up until 2015 when it was dismissed. It failed to get leave to be heard by the Supreme Court. When the issue has come before courts, governments have contested the right. And so you're absolutely right about that. What's different right now is that we have a federal government that, notwithstanding its historical position of opposing litigants from claiming their right in court, we have a federal government that has recognized and committed to progressively implement the right to housing, and they have put that in legislation. So previous attempts to litigate the right in court were based on an attempt to recognize through the Constitution constitutional provisions that protect the right to life and protect equality, to find a right to housing there. This is different. The government has legislated a right into federal legislation, and so long as that legislation exists, the National Housing Strategy Act exists, then that right exists, and the mechanisms to claim that right that I described earlier, so the housing advocate that you can take these issues to, who can then review them and make recommendations to the government and appoint a panel to have a hearing of individuals who are actually affected by those issues. All of that infrastructure remains in place so long as the legislation is in effect. So how do you claim it? That's a great question, and it's an important question. How you claim it is through the mechanisms, and the party responsible for ensuring that right is the government. And so again, the complaint would be made to the housing advocate. The housing advocate would consider it. They may make recommendations of the government. They may strike a hearing panel and have the hearing panel conduct a hearing that would look very much like any other sort of hearing or court procedure, to hear from witnesses and individuals who were affected, and again, make recommendations. And the government, by way of the minister, is obliged to respond to either of those two, to either the housing advocate recommendations or the recommendations of the hearing panel. One thing that is important to keep in mind is that the right to housing is not an individual, this is not an individual grievance mechanism, meaning that this is not a mechanism that is designed for any individual to bring their individual circumstances forward and seek a remedy. It was designed as and was intended to be a systemic, a place where systemic issues could go. I'll give you an example. In Toronto, the the percentage of homeless individuals living on the streets in Toronto right now I believe it's about 30 some odd percent is Indigenous. That is at the same time that Indigenous Torontonians constitute about 2% of the population. So that is a giant red flag that the government in its housing policy is failing Indigenous people very significantly. So that is a systemic issue that could be brought to the housing advocate for consideration. And the response, the sort of systemic remedy that would come from that process would be some kind of a remedy to address that issue at the level of policy. I hope that's helpful, but I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions that folks have about that.
You're mute, Yvonne.
Oh.
Again.
Yeah, I think I double clicked on it. Do you want to add to that?
I would like to add something from more of the grassroots perspective, as this is a very lengthy process and would not, and systemic. So I guess part of the question was, how would an individual navigate all of that if they have been exposed, you know, to trauma of homelessness, poverty, marginalization, racism, ableism that we do live in our every all the communities. The thing is, the conversations that we have to have broader in our communities is that service cannot be separated from advocacy, right? And the more we have stronger community groups, grassroots groups connected that are not paid by service managers, they're not staff, they have far greater scope, not only to provide direct supports, but actually to be the advocates, because they are a taxpayer, right? And they have a different way of raising the voice and saying, this is not just, this is not right. And through pandemic response, collaboration between services and some of the community groups has shown us that it's not without hiccups, but that we can work together when there's an encampment and eviction is imminent. How do we do it in a humane way, right? With the things are not taken away or put in a dumpster. How do we have a conversation what the next step is and what we can do right there in the moment when it's happened. So it is about grassroots. It is about understanding that we do have resources in our communities, as Michael reminded us so many times, and that we have to be local and have to be local together.
Thank you, Alex. And to that point, I just wanted to say, I'm not sure if we have any of the resources in the chat. I invite anyone who wants to put their information in the chat. So Alyssa for sure with CERA. I would do the legal clinic in York Region if I had access to the chat, but I don't. And I think, Alyssa, you shared a couple of things that I asked you to share for me because I couldn't do that, because those things kind of come in response to a couple of questions that I'm going to end with. I wanted to make comment. There's a couple of other questions. We can't get to actually absolutely all of them, but there's some other questions here that are just bringing up such insightful comments that I just have to share them. So one question is really about how do we support people concurrently throughout the different age groups. So appreciates the need to look at prevention when it comes to youth, because if we can stop that for them at a very young age, it'll reduce the fact that the opportunity for them to become homeless again and again throughout their lifetime. But if we think about those that are now making up a pretty big majority of people who are homeless or precariously housed, those over 50, those who maybe, you know, were that young person in the 80s or 90s when we still had decent housing strategy, but have lost their way and have kind of got caught up in a less than adequate support system or supportive housing system or lack of all of those above. So I think just to kind of leave that on people's minds as we think about, you know, we're always thinking about who do we have right now, but who has been lost in this wave of not doing very much about housing over the last 30 years or 20, 25 years, and what is also the cost of that. And if we continue to not address the commodification and financialization, are we ever going to get ahead of this? Probably not. So the last couple of questions and comments that were made, and I think some of the things in the chat are going to help answer that question for people. One person asked, next steps, how can an individual start their involvement in the right to housing and homelessness in York Region, so the movement? How can citizens make a difference? What can we do to move and make political and to move on political will? So those two questions really resonate with me, because I think that's why we started the Affordable Housing Coalition. I want people to check out in the chat again. We have a link for an endorsement. So if you believe that one of the ways that we can address some of these longstanding issues and make headway is to have a right to housing framework in York Region. So we'd appreciate that. And so anyone want to respond to that while I try to remember what our hashtag is for our Twitter handle for affordable housing. And so if anyone wants to speak to those things, like how can an ordinary citizen make a difference and how can we get involved? I would welcome you to involve join the coalition by emailing the Social Planning Council, again in the chat. But any last words on that?
Yeah, if I can jump in, I would say exactly what you just said. Find an organization that you can get behind and get behind it, support the work they're doing. As I've mentioned numerous times tonight, municipal governments have a lot of tools in their toolkit that can improve or accelerate the development of affordable housing. So take a bit of time and get to know what those tools are. And then when you do understand the planning tools that a municipality has, go out and lobby your local municipal councillors. Talk to them about the need, talk to them about the tools. I suspect a lot of councillors may not even understand the tools that they have at their disposal. But first and foremost, find an organization like yours, Yvonne, and get behind it and support it.
Thanks, Chris. Anyone else? Michael?
Hey, listen, this is more selfish, but right now, I mean, for Clovis and I think others, if you want to be part of the solution, we're looking to engage landlords across York Region, right? Even when we can pay market rent, many times the people that we're supporting don't have 90 credit scores, right? But they do have a whole organization and a bunch of organizations behind them that support them. And when you can't choose your neighbors and normally, but hey, if you have a home you're renting out, work with an organization like Braithwaite-360kids, Yellow Brick House, Sandgate, Loft in York Region, and you know what, I'm going to do a plug. There's programs like Clovis's program, Night Stop, where they're looking for volunteer hosts to take young people in before they become homeless, and it not only ruins their life, but also costs everyone a lot of money. So there's different ways to volunteer that way. Either if you have a home, get involved. And if you want to get involved as a volunteer host, there's a lot of homes in York Region where there's empty nesters in these massive homes. There's nowhere to downsize to. Use that space, use it wisely.
I'm so glad you mentioned those things. And I think, put a shameless plug in for your podcast too, Out of the Blue. So I think what we're going to have to do is also probably be able to send out a resource list if people want that. So please, if you want to get a resource list of some of these things that we're talking about, if you didn't catch it in the chat, so write to us at the Social Planning Council yr@gmail.com. I'll get that email and we can supply you with some of those other pieces. You can follow our Affordable Housing Coalition on Twitter, and I just had it, so it's at R2H York Region, and be part of it that way as well. So I think we've offered people some concrete ways of getting involved, some ways of getting involved with advocating. And part of this, like I have to say, it's a huge steep learning curve when it comes to all things housing. So take advantage of opportunities like this to learn more. And Michael's podcast, I'm not sure how often it airs. Is it once a month, once every 2 weeks, Michael?
No, it's every Thursday there's a new podcast. We have over 70. Clovis, Alyssa, Chris have been on.
Yeah.
People from around the world. It's a class, it's an education on housing. It's 20, 30 minutes.
It's awesome.
Take a listen, especially to these people who joined tonight.
Yep. Awesome. So there you have it, a whole plethora of ideas and ways to get involved and some food for thought. I think a lot of people will be going, oh, I better watch that movie Push if I didn't watch it 2 weeks ago, because that's a whole, I call that kind of like a course on learning about housing and financialization of housing and what we can do differently. So I want to thank all of my fantastic panelists. It was such a pleasure to spend this evening with you, to hear about all the work you're doing. And I am pretty aware of a lot of the work you're doing, but I think for many people, this was a lot of new information, a lot of really exciting information, and a pretty sober message, which is we don't have much choice. We have to do something really differently, and we have to do a lot of things really differently. And that includes getting involved in your local municipality. So give us a shout. We'd be really thrilled to talk with all of you. I want to say another big thank you to everyone at the Aurora Public Library who have put on both of these events for us, handled all the technology. We'd be lost without you, and it's just been a pleasure partnering with you again on offering some of these important events. So with all of that, I will just say thank you to everyone again. Have a great night, and I'm sure we'll see you at a future event, and look forward to getting some emails from you.
Community conversation, participation, and hopefully action. Through the threads of the 2020 selection of Scarborough by Catherine Hernandez, our community has been discussing the intersection of racism, classism, privilege, and precarious housing. Thank you to Yvonne Kelly for organizing and facilitation, to Lucy Frechette for technical support, to our panelists for sharing their expertise, and to you, our viewers, for joining us this evening.
Have a good night, everybody.